If you were given the opportunity to leave England tomorrow, would you take it? Increasingly, a growing number of British citizens are answering that question with a decisive yes, at a time when millions across the globe still aspire to reach London. Those already living here are quietly preparing their exit. In recent years, hundreds of thousands of Britons have chosen to relocate abroad, not for leisure, not for retirement, but because, quite simply, building a stable and sustainable life in England is becoming progressively more difficult. The cost of living has surged. Housing has moved beyond the reach of ordinary families, and cities that once stood as pillars of economic strength are beginning to show visible signs of decline. Former industrial powerhouses and global financial centers are no longer retaining their populations. High streets are emptying, properties sit unoccupied, and younger generations, particularly families, are steadily disappearing from local communities. This raises a serious question. What is happening to a country once regarded as one of the most desirable places to live in the world? In this report, we examine 10 cities where outward migration is most pronounced, places that once symbolized opportunity, now increasingly associated with uncertainty and departure. There was a time when a working-class family in England could look forward to a summer holiday in Blackpool. It wasn't the French Riviera, nor was it meant to be. It was accessible, familiar, and distinctly British. A simple journey to the West Coast, where the illuminated Blackwall Tower became a symbol of leisure and escape. Throughout the 20th century, millions visited every year. Children with ice cream in hand, adults gathered in seaside pubs. Blackpool offered a temporary reprieve from the demands of industrial life. Today, however, the picture is markedly different. While the physical structures remain the hotels, the promenade, the purpose of many of these spaces, has shifted. Reports indicate that numerous former hotels have been repurposed into temporary accommodation for vulnerable populations, including those dependent on welfare or without stable housing. What was once a thriving seaside resort increasingly resembles a holding space for those with limited options. Population figures reflect this shift. Blackpool's population stands at approximately 143,000 in 2026, down from 148,300 in 2001. On the surface, a decline of just over 5,000 may appear modest, but for a town of this scale, particularly one reliant on a stable working population, the impact is significant. The consequences extend beyond population numbers. Health outcomes in Blackpool are among the most concerning in England. Male life expectancy is currently around 73.7 years, the lowest nationally. More striking still is the average healthy life expectancy, which sits at just 50.9 years. This suggests that many residents begin facing serious health challenges relatively early in life. Researchers have pointed to deeper social factors contributing to this gap, including issues linked to what are often described as deaths of despair, a term encompassing mental health struggles, self-harm, and broader social distress. Economic pressures are equally evident. Real incomes have declined by approximately £16 per week since 2015. While such a figure may appear marginal in statistical terms, for many households it represents a meaningful reduction in living standards, the difference between financial stability and daily compromise. At the same time, reported violent crime has risen by around 12% in a single year. Certain coastal areas are experiencing increasing vacancy rates. Buildings that once served tourists now stand unused for extended periods. Perhaps most notably, younger, educated individuals are choosing to leave, not out of rejection of the city itself, but in pursuit of better opportunities elsewhere. The result is a gradual demographic shift, an aging population with fewer economically active residents remaining. This leads to an unavoidable question. Is Blackpool in long-term decline, or simply navigating a difficult period of transition? On its own, this might be dismissed as a localized challenge, a single coastal town struggling to adapt. But as we move inland, the pattern becomes becomes harder to ignore. Consider Birmingham. If Blackpool represented leisure, Birmingham once embodied productivity. It was known, with some justification, as the workshop of the world. From its industrial base in the Midlands, machinery, steel components, and engineering outputs were exported across the British Empire. In many ways, Birmingham functioned as the operational core of the nation's economy, the hands to London's strategic brain. But today, those hands appear increasingly strained. Recent social data indicates that 282 areas within Birmingham now rank among the 10% most deprived in England. In certain communities, child poverty rates reach as high as 61.7%. This is not merely a statistical concern. It represents a profound shift in the economic reality of a city that once drove industrial output on a global scale. In practical terms, this means that in a city which once powered industrial output for much of the world, a growing number of families now struggle with something far more basic, keeping their homes warm through the winter months. Yet, perhaps the more telling development is not the hardship itself, but the quiet, consistent outflow of people. Data from the Office for National Statistics indicates that more than 30,000 residents are now leaving Birmingham each year, while inward migration fails to keep pace. This is not a dramatic or highly visible exodus. There are no headlines of mass departures, no symbolic caravans leaving the city. Instead, it unfolds gradually. Families relocate, skilled professionals accept opportunities elsewhere, graduates leave, and increasingly, they do not return. This steady loss of younger, economically active residents has long-term implications. As this demographic declines, the character and capacity of the city inevitably begin to shift. Housing pressures further compound the issue. Birmingham is currently estimated to be short of approximately 89,000 homes, while annual construction delivers only around 4,000 units. The imbalance is stark. Rental costs are projected to rise by nearly 9.5% in 2024 alone, placing additional strain on households already facing financial pressure. At the same time, key industries that once underpinned the regional economy are contracting. The automotive sector, historically a cornerstone of the Midlands, is expected to lose over £6.2 billion in value in the coming years, driven in part by post-Brexit trade adjustments. For many engineers and skilled workers, this signals uncertainty. Increasingly, they are exploring opportunities abroad in Europe, in Australia, not necessarily out of preference, but out of pragmatism. The underlying concern is not simply that individuals are leaving, but why they feel compelled to do so. The perception, rightly or wrongly, is that the economic engine of Birmingham is no longer operating with the same reliability it once did. This sense of strain was underscored in 2023 when Birmingham City Council issued a Section 114 notice, effectively declaring financial bankruptcy. The symbolism is difficult to ignore. A city that once helped drive industrial production on a global scale now faces challenges in maintaining its own fiscal stability. This raises fundamental questions about sustainability. Can a city continue to function effectively when the economic structures that supported it begin to weaken? And if the outflow of professionals, engineers, healthcare workers, graduates continues, who will sustain its essential systems in the decades ahead? Is this decline or simply transition? That remains open to interpretation, but the indicators suggest a period of significant structural change. Birmingham, however, is still a major urban centre. Its challenges are complex but not necessarily irreversible. The next case, by contrast, presents a different kind of pressure, one driven less by industrial contraction and more by rapid population growth combined with rising living costs. Consider Luton, located approximately 50 kilometres from London. Luton has long functioned as a commuter city, a more affordable alternative for those working in the capital. For decades, it offered a practical compromise, proximity without the full financial burden of London life. In recent years, that balance has begun to shift. Luton's population population has expanded rapidly, reaching approximately 225,000 residents, an increase of nearly 25% since 2001. However, infrastructure development has not kept pace with this growth. The result is increasing strain on housing, services, and overall living conditions. Recent social research indicates that around 9% of households in Luton are now experiencing destitution. In absolute terms, this equates to roughly 20,000 individuals unable to consistently meet basic needs, such as adequate heating or proper nutrition. Within the context of a G7 economy, these figures are difficult to overlook. At the same time, the broader cost of living continues to rise sharply. Over a 3-year period, food prices across the UK have increased by approximately 30.6%. Surveys suggest that 91% of the population perceives the cost of living as still rising. For many households, this is not an abstract economic trend, it too is a daily reality. Residents often describe the experience in practical terms. Living conditions feel increasingly constrained. The physical space remains unchanged, but financial pressure intensifies. The margin for stability narrows. Housing dynamics reinforce this pressure. Property prices in Luton have risen among the fastest in England, yet wage growth has not kept pace. The result is a widening gap between income and affordability. As some residents put it, Luton offers a view of London, but not the means to live within reach of it. Then came a significant industrial setback. The closure of the Vauxhall manufacturing plant, an institution in the city for over 120 years, marked the loss of thousands of jobs. For a city already experiencing population pressure, the removal of such a major employer represents a substantial economic shock. The consequences are now becoming visible. Internal migration data suggests that between 7,000 and 8,000 residents leave Luton each year, often relocating to regions in the north of England where living costs are lower. Again, this is not a sudden or chaotic movement. It is gradual and deliberate. A family relocates to Leeds. A technician moves to Sheffield. A young couple seeks opportunity in Manchester. Over time, these individual decisions accumulate into a broader demographic shift. In effect, what emerges is a form of pressure release. The city is not lacking in population, in fact, quite the opposite. What it lacks is capacity. Capacity in housing, capacity in infrastructure, capacity in opportunity. When population density rises rapidly while costs escalate and employment prospects weaken, the outcome is predictable. Residents begin to feel constrained, and in some cases, that constraint evolves into a sense of entrapment. The question then is how to interpret this moment. Is Luton becoming an example of unsustainable urban pressure, a system stretched beyond its limits? Or is it simply experiencing the growing pains of economic transition, adjusting to new demographic and financial realities? The answer, as with Birmingham, is unlikely to be straightforward, but the trend itself is increasingly difficult to ignore. There are certain cities whose names alone evoke an entire chapter of national history. Liverpool is one of them. Once the busiest port in England, it served as a gateway to the world ships departing with goods, ambition, and, for many, the promise of a better future. Today, much of that physical legacy remains intact. The red brick architecture, the Albert Dock, the historic streets, they are all still there. What is less visible, however, is the sense of stability that once defined the city. Recent internal migration data indicates that approximately 9,000 residents leave Liverpool each year. The majority are young, working-age individuals. There is no dramatic exodus, no sudden collapse. Instead, it is a series of quiet, individual decisions. A nurse relocates to Manchester in search of affordability. A technology professional accepts an opportunity in Dublin. A young couple emigrates to Australia. Gradually, the city loses the very people who sustain its day-to-day functioning. Housing lies at the centre of this issue. Liverpool faces an estimated shortfall shortfall of more than 230,000 homes to meet long-term demand. At the same time, over 12,000 families remain on waiting lists for social housing. Yet, according to local reports, only a limited number of new social housing units have been completed in the past year. The contrast is striking. A city that once managed vast volumes of global trade now struggles to provide sufficient housing for its own residents. Meanwhile, rental costs continue to rise at close to 10% annually. For workers in essential sectors, healthcare, education, public services, the ability to live near their place of work is becoming increasingly difficult. Over time, the impact extends beyond financial strain. It begins to erode public confidence, not through sudden unrest, but through a quieter, more persistent sense of fatigue, a perception that systems are no longer functioning as effectively as they once did. This raises a broader question. Can a city remain viable if its workforce cannot secure stable housing? And when trust in basic systems begins to decline, can economic growth figures alone compensate for that loss? If Liverpool represents a story rooted in history, Bradford presents a case of unrealized potential. Demographically, Bradford holds a clear advantage. Approximately 27% of its population is under the age of 19, making it one of the youngest cities in England. In theory, this should position the city for long-term growth, a dynamic, youthful workforce capable of driving innovation. In practice, the situation is more complex. Each year, between 24,000 and 25,000 people leave Bradford, many of them recent graduates or individuals at the beginning of their careers. The issue is not a lack of population, but a lack of opportunity. Educational attainment and skill levels place the city within the lowest 10% nationally, limiting the development of high-income employment sectors. As a result, those with the capacity to leave often do so. Opportunities in Leeds, Manchester, or further afield prove more attractive. The effects are visible in the city centre. Retail areas that were once active, such as Kirkgate Market, now show increasing vacancy rates. In some cases, traditional businesses have been replaced by lower-margin services, vape shops, betting outlets, discount retailers. There is a local sentiment, sometimes expressed with a degree of irony, that Bradford functions as a training ground. It educates and develops young people, only for them to build their careers elsewhere. While this may suggest a functioning educational pipeline, the long-term benefit is often realized outside the city itself. This presents a structural challenge. Can sustained development occur if a city consistently loses its youngest and most capable residents? If its future workforce is effectively exported year after year, what remains to drive internal growth? A different dynamic can be observed in Peterborough. On paper, Peterborough appears to be a success story. Its population has grown by approximately 17.5% since 2011, nearly double the national average. New housing developments are emerging and inward migration remains strong. However, rapid growth does not always equate to sustainable development. In Peterborough, the pace of expansion is beginning to outstrip the city's capacity to absorb it. House prices have increased by over 103% since 2018, while average incomes have risen by only around 19%. The rental market is under significant strain, with vacancy rates as low as 1.1%. For many residents, the impact is tangible. Households are subdividing living spaces, commuting distances are increasing, access to suitable employment is becoming more challenging. As living costs rise, a familiar pattern begins to emerge: outward migration. Estimates suggest that around 6,000 residents leave Peterborough each year, many of them young, skilled workers. The paradox is clear. While the city continues to grow through new arrivals, it simultaneously loses long-term residents. This creates a more transient community, one characterized by movement rather than stability. Some local observations reflect this sentiment, that planning decisions appear more aligned with statistical targets than lived experience. On paper, indicators suggest growth. On the ground, ground, residents report increasing pressure, slower services, crowded hospitals, and limited high-quality employment opportunities. The question, then, is whether Peterborough is developing effectively or expanding at a pace that risks undermining its own stability. Turning to Scotland, Glasgow presents a different set of challenges. Historically, Glasgow stood as one of Europe's major industrial centres. Shipbuilding along the River Clyde was central to its identity, contributing to both economic strength and national pride. Today, however, the primary issue facing the city is not industry, it is housing. In 2025, Glasgow officially declared a housing emergency. Demand for emergency accommodation exceeds 16,000 cases annually, while the supply of social housing continues to fall short. Thousands of families are now reliant on temporary housing solutions, often for extended periods. Social indicators further highlight the depth of the challenge. The rate of deaths among the homeless stands at approximately 94.8 per million, the highest in Scotland. Additionally, around 42% of students qualify for free school meals, pointing to persistent, multi-generational poverty. Under such conditions, outward migration becomes an expected response. Around 8,000 residents leave Glasgow each year, many of them from middle-income or graduate backgrounds. The contrast is stark. A city that once constructed ships for global trade now faces difficulty in providing basic housing for its population. The broader question is whether recovery is possible when foundational issues such as housing and inequality remain unresolved. In England, Hull reflects yet another dimension of this national pattern. Once a significant port in East Yorkshire, Hull's history is defined by trade and maritime activity. Today, however, the dominant narrative is one of relative decline, a sense of being overlooked in broader economic development. Socioeconomic data suggests that over 90% of residential areas in Hull rank below the national average in terms of prosperity, with some among the most deprived in the country. In such conditions, outward migration becomes particularly concentrated among younger residents. Estimates indicate that between 5,000 and 6,000 people leave Hull each year, often seeking opportunities in cities such as Leeds, Manchester, or regions further south. As younger populations depart, the demographic profile shifts. The city ages, placing additional pressure on healthcare systems and reducing the growth potential of local revenues. This raises a critical question. Can recovery occur if a city experiences prolonged economic stagnation? And is a slow, quiet decline potentially more damaging than more visible crises? A similar pattern can be observed in Stoke-on-Trent, historically known as the ceramics capital of England. Stoke-on-Trent built its identity around manufacturing. For centuries, its kilns produced goods that were distributed across Europe. At its peak, a significant proportion of ceramics used across the continent originated from this region. Today, that industrial base has largely diminished. Globalization, rising production costs, and changing market conditions have led to widespread factory closures. In 2023 alone, an estimated 5,000 businesses ceased operations in the area. The economic impact is evident. Crime rates have risen to approximately 100 incidents per 1,000 people, around 47% higher than the regional average. This is not necessarily a reflection of cultural change, but rather a consequence of economic contraction. Where employment opportunities decline, social pressures often follow. Migration trends reflect this reality. Between 4,000 and 5,000 residents leave Stoke-on-Trent annually, many of them younger, skilled individuals, with average weekly earnings around $694, significantly below national levels. The incentive to relocate is clear. The broader challenge is existential. When the industry that once sustained a city disappears, can a new economic identity be established? And without retaining younger generations, who will shape that future? Finally, there is London. For decades, London has been perceived as the center of opportunity, a global financial hub attracting talent from across the UK and beyond. Yet recent trends trends suggest a notable shift. Over the past 18 months, approximately 347,000 residents have left the capital. This represents one of the most significant internal migration movements in London's modern history. Importantly, this is not driven by dissatisfaction with the city itself. Rather, it reflects a growing inability to afford life within it. Rental costs have risen sharply. A one-bedroom property in Zone 2 now commands nearly $2,400 per month, double the level seen in 2019. Meanwhile, real wages have remained largely stagnant for over a decade. This creates a clear paradox. London continues to generate wealth, yet its residents face increasing difficulty in maintaining a basic standard of living. At the same time, around 87,000 homes remain vacant, collectively valued at approximately $30 billion. Many new developments function less as residential spaces and more as financial assets. Meanwhile, homelessness has increased, with more than 1 in 50 residents affected and around 100,000 children having left the city over the past decade. London remains open, but increasingly only to those who can afford it. This brings us to a broader national reflection. Across these cities, the issue is not solely economic data or migration statistics. It is the gradual erosion of something less tangible, but equally important, a sense of stability, of continuity, of belonging. Not every city examined here is in decline. Many are undergoing transformation, but collectively they point to a deeper question. What happens when long-standing economic models begin to shift? Can a nation maintain growth if the cities that once powered it are steadily losing their populations? And as more individuals seek opportunities elsewhere, should this be interpreted as decline or as a necessary phase of structural adjustment? These are questions that extend beyond any single city. They speak to the direction of the country as a whole. If you found this analysis useful, you may wish to follow further coverage examining the evolving economic and social landscape across the United Kingdom. The information presented here is drawn from publicly available sources, including data from the Office for National Statistics, local authority reports, and recent socio-economic studies. It is intended to provide context and analysis, not to assign blame or offer prescriptive conclusions.